Welcome to the Sugar and Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Kayla Gergen, and today I'm going to be breaking down insulin. We're going to be talking about what insulin is, what it does. I am organizing this in a two-part series. So you're here in part one. We're going to be talking about the why insulin is such a big deal. I think myself included and other folks online, you might have this negative impression of insulin, and I just want to clear things up a little bit and show you that insulin isn't necessarily such a bad guy, but we have to be strategic about it. So we'll talk about hormones because insulin is a hormone. We'll talk about what hormones do and insulin specifically. And then part two, we're going to be talking about how do we become insulin resistant and what to do about it, because insulin can be a very, very tricky thing. If you're trying really hard to lose weight, if you feel like you're doing all of these things, yet you're just not getting the results that you want, a lot of times there is a measure of blood sugar imbalance or insulin resistance in there that might be tripping you up. So this episode is for you if you want to learn a little bit more about insulin and what to do about it. So we're laying the foundation today. And before I even get into that, I just want to say that I had hopes of having this episode out a couple of weeks ago, I think. And life has just been lifing. I feel like I tell myself I'm going to start a podcast, and then life tells me that things are going the other direction. But just to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit and give you some insights, both personally and professionally. So professionally, I am a one-woman show. So I'm really trying to tighten up, where my time is going and being really mindful about how I'm partitioning my energy. So I have not been on social media as much as I have been because I'm working on the back end just to kind of tighten up some automations and some systems to help me be able to run more efficiently without running myself ragged. Because when you reply to emails or when you message me, that is all coming through me. And I haven't been as responsive lately. So first of all, if you've sent me messages, I'm really sorry. I'm hoping to get caught up on those shortly. And then one of my big motivators for this is on the personal end of things. If you've been following me for a while, maybe you've known that the past couple of years has been a little bit crazy, I guess, family or personal wise. My folks were in a really bad car accident about a year and a half ago. They've made a full recovery. We are very, very thankful for that. Around that same time, we got a diagnosis for one of Jeremy's parents, and now that diagnosis is now terminal, so I did not have crying on the podcast for my bingo card today, so thank you for bearing with me. But so needless to say, things have been anything but normal, but I feel like that has been the normal for a lot of folks lately, and I feel like this is a moment I've been bracing for over the past couple of years. Just if you're maybe new to my story or don't know a lot about me personally, my husband and I both come from families who've separated and remarried, so we have a lot of parents, needless to say. Between the two of us, we have 8 parents, and it's a little daunting to think that this is just the beginning. This is our first encounter kind of helping people get affairs in order, and yeah, it's tough. So anyway, there's a little update. I know everybody has their shit, right? And I feel like it's just nice to hear the truth sometimes. I feel like a lot of times, I know Jeremy and I have just encountered neighbors or, things in conversation. It's just, how are things going? And it's like, it's okay. And I think that's just refreshing to be honest. So there's me peeling back the curtain a little bit just to give you a little insight into kind of what's happening on the business end of things. I know everybody's got their things that they're going through, so just know that, my thoughts and prayers are with you because, life sometimes, and it's not easy, but I think also, we have these moments that without them, I feel like it makes the other end of things not so rich, so we have to have that contrast. But with that in mind, let's talk about insulin. Before we hop into insulin and talking about what that does, we have to take a step back and talk about hormones because insulin is a hormone, so we need a little bit of an understanding on what hormones do. And essentially, hormones are chemical messengers and they regulate metabolic processes in the body. So they will help with everything from blood sugar to blood pressure to mood. They have a lot of different functions. And I'm going to use the analogy of emails because I feel like this is something that we can all maybe relate to. So if you think of hormones as basically the body sending emails to different departments or systems. So these emails are sent and they're telling different systems what to start working on, what to slow down, what to speed up, when to change directions. And some examples, I mentioned insulin, our star of the show today, is a hormone. Other hormones that you may have heard of are things like melatonin. So that is a hormone that sends a message out and it tells your body when it's time to go to sleep. Other hormones like estrogen and testosterone, they influence body composition and reproduction. Other hormones related to blood pressure are ADH or antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Those two help control fluid balance and thus impact blood pressure. And then what is really popular right now are things like GLP-1 and GIP relating to injectable medications that help promote those naturally occurring hormones. So if you missed the episode about GLP-1s, what they do, you can head back into previous episodes and check that one out because I really dive into specifically what the GLP-1 hormones do, or glucagon like peptide 1 and GIP. Those are the two big ones that are targeted by medications like semaglutide or tirzepatide. Brand names, those are things like Ozempic or Zepbound. So check that episode out because that is just rich with nuggets about those hormones in particular. When we're thinking about what hormones look like in the medical system, if you've ever seen an endocrinologist, or maybe you've heard of an endocrinologist, that essentially is a doctor who specializes in hormone problems. So things like diabetes, thyroid disorders, PCOS, cortisol, all of those hormones, or endocrinology is essentially that umbrella term for hormone disorders. So if that helps connect the dots a little bit more, if you're wondering what an endocrinologist or what endocrinology means. And hormones just don't come from one place. So a few other examples of organs that they come from. We talked a little bit just now about specific hormones, but when we talk about the organs in your body that produce hormones, the pancreas is one. And your pancreas produces insulin, again, our star of the show today, and it also produces glucagon. So that works kind of in opposition of insulin. So we'll talk about that relationship a little bit more today. Thyroid. So your thyroid is going to send out your thyroid hormones, and those control all kinds of things from your metabolism to body temperature. Anyone that's had a thyroid disorder, things just feel off. Other organs that fall under that endocrinology umbrella, so the ovaries and the testes, these are what are releasing those sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. The gut, so think of your intestine, that releases a lot of appetite regulating hormones. Your fat cells are even like an organ of their own. They are releasing hormones. And your muscle, so oftentimes your muscle is signaling molecules during exercise as well. If we go back to that email analogy, your body isn't run by one boss, essentially. Maybe in a little bit of a ways it is by your brain, which is regulating some things. However, it's more like a group chat or a group email where everyone is constantly messaging each other. There is no hormone that really rules over all. They kind of work in concert with each other. So think of them more as departments with different messages and memos that are going out versus one ruling body. And if anything, our brain is probably at the top of that HR structure when we think about your hormones or your endocrine system, how that is regulated. Your brain is going to kind of be like that CEO, and then you have the other body systems that are below it sending their messages to people down the funnel. And one final thing before we hop into talking about insulin specifically, we have to think of the body in a fasted state, so no food, and then also a fed state, because that is going to really shift what hormones are at play. So for example, when you're in a fasted state, when you haven't eaten for several hours, your body is going to shift into a fuel release mode. So essentially your body is releasing stored energy. So it is releasing stored glycogen from your liver, and it's also tapping into fat stores as well. When we are in a fasted state, we have these mechanisms in play where your blood sugar is kept in this tight range, even without food coming in. And then when we shift over to the fed state, so that's going to be after a meal, your body is switching to storage mode. So we're kind of switching back and forth. And this isn't necessarily like an on or off switch. So if you've heard me talk about metabolic flexibility in the past, I feel like it's more like a lever where you have multiple levers at various degrees. So it's not like once you eat a meal, everything's, flipped back to the other direction. You might have some of these hormones still, down regulated in the background, but they're often still there. So just know that this isn't an on or off switch. It's more one system is more up or down regulated. So for example, when you eat a meal, insulin goes up. Glucagon, which is the opposite of insulin, it doesn't mean it completely disappears, but it is down regulated, meaning it's kind of pushed back until your body's able to process some of that. And I mentioned at the top of the episode how I think sometimes we think of insulin as a bad thing, but it isn't. Really, without insulin, we would have to be eating all of the time because we wouldn't have the capability to store things. So insulin is like your storage hormone, which can be a little bit scary, especially if you're on a fat loss or weight loss journey. It can make things a little bit more tricky, but essentially it's that hormone that helps move nutrients from your bloodstream into your cells. Oftentimes you'll hear insulin described as a key that helps unlock cells so nutrients can get in. And it does do just that. So when insulin is in circulation, it is coming up to your cells, it's unlocking those doors, letting things like glucose and other nutrients like amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, in. And without insulin, those things would just stay in the blood. So for example, when we're talking about blood sugar, without insulin, your glucose would just keep circulating and it would go higher and higher and higher. Insulin is one of those only things that can really help shuttle into the cells. Movement is another way, but we're not really talking about that today. I believe I talked about that in maybe episode 3 or 4, so you can always head back and check that one out. Without insulin, your cells can't access it. So all of those nutrients are right on the other side of the door. And with insulin, that is essentially going to open up that door, let those nutrients flood in, which is, again, a good thing. But the problem nowadays is not that we don't have enough insulin, it's that our insulin just isn't working like it should be. And circling back to that email analogy, I want to talk a little bit about diabetes, how that forms. So we'll talk briefly about type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and then diabetes 1.5, or what's known as LADA or LADA, latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. For the sake of clarity, I just want to talk about diabetes in the scope of insulin, because when we talk about things like type 1 diabetes, or this is where we are picking up diabetes in childhood, for example. So I just had a nephew, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, just wasn't feeling good. They went to the ER and here he was in diabetic ketoacidosis. I can't remember what his blood sugar was. I want to say it was over 500, but we see just sky high blood sugar levels, and that is because there is no insulin at all. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where your immune system is mistakenly destroying the cells of the pancreas, specifically the cells that create insulin. So thinking about that email analogy, type 1 diabetes is like not having the ability to send any emails. You have zero communication. The email server, which is your pancreas, has been completely shut down. So the body can't send that insulin message. And that's why people with type 1 diabetes need insulin from the outside. So they have to inject insulin, or sometimes you'll see where they have an insulin pump. And that is a huge learning curve just to know and balance insulin and carbohydrates so you're not going too low on your blood sugar, because that can be really deadly as well. So in summary, type 1 diabetes is like not having an email server at all. You have no communication with those other systems. With type 2 diabetes, this is late stage insulin resistance, and this is the most common. So type 2 diabetes is very different from type 1. It's when the pancreas is still sending emails. So you have that email server, those emails are going out. Sometimes it's a lot of emails. And the problem is that the department isn't receiving the message. So all of these emails are going out. They're not getting your messages. So all of a sudden I'm sending more emails and more emails and more emails. And you've got all of these emails in circulation, but nobody is opening them. Really frustrating, right? And the departments that aren't specifically opening them are your muscle, your fat, your liver. They're just not responding. So you have lots of emails, but you also have just nobody opening these emails. Think of it like having a big spam filter, set up. Those emails aren't coming in, and that is essentially insulin resistance. So that spam filter or that insulin resistance, those emails are there, but they're not making it to the department because they're just not getting through. And then we have diabetes 1.5, or again, the latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. And we've seen maybe some increasing cases of this, but it oftentimes can be misdiagnosed. It's very much like type 1, where your immune system is attacking those cells in the pancreas, but oftentimes it's later in life. So it's like having your email system work fine for years, but then something triggers a problem. This could be a virus or an internal attack on your server. So over time, that system slowly shuts down. So at first it might look like type 2 diabetes, where maybe your email or your pancreas, your email server is sending out those messages, but all of a sudden those messages just really slow down with time. And then all of a sudden that email server shuts down. You have no messages or emails going out. So at first it appears, again, like type 2 diabetes, but then as that pancreas degrades over time, it turns into essentially type 1 diabetes, where your autoimmunity or your immune system has just attacked your pancreas to the point where now it's no longer producing anything. This can be diagnosed with an antibody blood test, and treatment looks very much like it does for type 1 diabetes, where now you're not making your own insulin, so now you have to inject or use something like an insulin pump to do that for you. To summarize that section, I'll close with a little summary of each. So type 1 diabetes is like no emails can be sent. Type 2 diabetes is like there's lots of emails, but the spam filters are preventing those messages from being received. And then with type 1.5 diabetes, or LADA, however you like to say your A's, the email system just slowly degrades and shuts down over time. But as you can see, all of those are very different scenarios. And what we see most common, or what will be our kind of primary focus for the conversation for the remainder of today and then into part 2 of this series, we'll be talking about specifically insulin and insulin resistance, which is more relevant to that type 2 diabetes. So what does insulin actually do? And while we have lots of hormones that raise blood sugar, so we have cortisol and adrenaline, those are activated a lot of times in response to a stressor. And then we also have glucagon. So that's the opposite of insulin. So when insulin is low, glucagon is higher. Again, these things aren't necessarily shut on or off. When one is high, one is low. And glucagon is one of those hormones that can signal to your body, now we're in, fuel mode. We want to break down things to get fuel, versus when insulin is high, that is one of the only hormones in the body that's going to help lower blood sugar. So it's taking that blood sugar out of your bloodstream and pushing it into your cells, primarily your fat cells, your liver, and your muscle. Those are the three big ones. And insulin is the only hormone that can do that. So without insulin, you can see how this could be very detrimental. We just have super, super high blood sugar, which leads to things like inflammation, and that creates this whole cascade of problem. So insulin isn't necessarily a bad thing. What I should maybe clarify is that we just want to keep our bodies as insulin sensitive as possible. When that insulin is released by the pancreas, we want to be very receptive to it. Thinking back to that lock and key analogy, I like to think of like insulin resistance is when you've got those keys, but maybe they're sticky. They're getting stuck in the lock. Maybe you've got to oil your, chambers in there. Things just aren't opening the doors like they used to. So we want to make sure that when insulin is released, that key is nice and clean. It's opening doors, it's letting things in quickly, and then insulin is coming down. It's doing its job and it's getting out of the way. Because when insulin is in circulation all the time and it's not connecting with those cells, that is when we're just stuck in that storage mode. We have poor metabolic flexibility. You're not able to activate that breakdown or that fuel breakdown mode where your body's shifting from storage mode to now breaking down what you already have. So you have really poor metabolic flexibility, which symptom-wise might show up like really struggling to make it more than 2 or 3 hours without eating. If that's you, chances are you probably have poor metabolic flexibility. The good news is that you can improve that with time. We'll get into more of that in part 2 when we talk about why or how insulin resistance develops and what you can do about it. Ultimately, insulin being able to move glucose into the muscle and other cells is a really good thing. Like I mentioned, if our blood sugar stays high, that can create just essentially a metabolic shitstorm where you have this low grade inflammation, and that creates just a cascade of problems. And especially after a workout. So if you think you've kind of burned down maybe some of those stores that you've got, especially after a workout, your muscles are like a sponge for circulating glucose. So even, without insulin, we are able to take up some of that glucose when we're contracting those muscles. But specifically after a workout, it can be really, really helpful to, purposely include something like carbohydrates, because that's going to help replenish some of those stores that you burned up during your workout. So something like post-workout carbs can actually be really helpful because it is kind of triggering that insulin to jump, and that's helping nutrients get into those cells. So if there's any time of day that you want your insulin to maybe go up a little bit, it's right after a workout, because think about that is just flooding those cells that you just worked really hard with all of these wonderful nutrients. So again, insulin isn't necessarily a bad thing. We just want to be really strategic about when it's high and if we can use that to our advantage, like after a workout, for example. And without insulin, we would have zero ability to store energy for later. We wouldn't be able to store glycogen or stored carbohydrate in our liver or muscles. So think about it. You wouldn't be able to lay down at night and sleep. You would have to get up and eat to keep your blood sugar at a certain amount if you didn't have those stores. So insulin helps build up those reserves in your liver and your muscle, so that way you can go for extended hours without eating. And it also helps put some of that energy into your fat cells as well. So your fat cells are just like your energy reserves. And again, if you have some poor metabolic flexibility or some insulin resistance, those keys are sticking. Sometimes it can be really tricky to get into those fat stores, especially at first. But if you're consistent and doing some of the right things, which we'll talk about again in part 2, that is, really, really going to be helpful over time. So if weight loss is your goal and you're doing it without thinking about how you can improve that insulin sensitivity, in the long run, you might be setting yourself up worse off if you're just going after something like a quick fix versus taking a step back and just looking at your overall metabolic health, specifically thinking about your level of insulin resistance. And I'm working on a metabolic assessment right now. I'm hoping to have that out within maybe the next week or 2. We'll see what life throws this way, but I'm working on a metabolic assessment that takes less than 5 minutes to fill out. And once I do, I'll make sure I drop that in the show notes. So look for that if you're catching this episode maybe a week or 2 after it releases. Maybe by the time I edit this, I'll have the link in there. But it takes 5 minutes to fill out, and I have some questions that just kind of stem on blood sugar imbalance, looking at some of your particular symptoms or maybe medical diagnosis, and I am responding to every single one of them. So if you want a little bit of personalized feedback on maybe what your blood sugar is doing, whether it's working for you or against you, check out that metabolic assessment. I respond personally with some feedback on all of those. So with that in mind, please allow for a little bit of extra time, up to 24, 48 hours, because I am personally looking over those and responding. So it takes 5 minutes on your end to fill out, but just know that that's your opportunity to get personal feedback from me, and there's no strings attached to that. So be on the lookout for that blood sugar and metabolic assessment coming soon. To paint a little bit more contrast with insulin, I want to talk briefly about glucagon. And this is essentially insulin's counterpart. So when insulin is high, glucagon is low, and vice versa. And what's interesting is in my GLP-1 episode, I talked about how there is a GLP-1 triple agonist that is in studies right now. I don't know kind of what phase of FDA testing it's in, but there is a drug in testing called retatrutide. It's very much like Zepbound and Mounjaro, where it's a dual agonist, but it actually adds on a third agonist, and that is glucagon. So if you think when insulin is high, that storage mode, the opposite of that is that we're getting into fuel mode. We're breaking things down to find fuel from other sources, whether that's liver glycogen, we're getting energy from there, or your fat stores. So this new medication is actually going to help leverage glucagon. And the thought is that maybe we'll see some of these muscle sparing benefits as well. So I would imagine, I don't know what the release is, we'll maybe see that sometime in maybe late 2026 or 2027 would be my guess. To use another analogy to contrast insulin and glucagon, think of insulin like your storage manager. It is boxing things up and it's putting them away, whereas glucagon is the energy withdrawal manager. So glucagon is going around and hunting for where it can find energy, whether it's the liver, whether it's tapping into fat stores. To summarize what we've covered so far, we have insulin, which is the primary hormone that helps blood sugar get into the cells. And insulin is a hormone that, again, falls under that endocrinology umbrella. So we have endocrinology, that's the study of hormones. Insulin is just one of those hormones in that bigger umbrella. And when we're thinking about hormones in general, again, thinking about we have these different department heads throughout the company that are sending messages. We have one department kind of giving guidance to one, maybe it's marketing, they're telling people like, okay, you got to talk to sales, you got to do this. So all of these hormones are, going on and in concert all of the time. So it's really amazing, the machine that is our body and all of those different processes that are just flowing in and around each other. And when we're talking about things like blood sugar in particular, insulin and glucagon are really going to help keep that blood sugar in a tight range. So when we have eaten a meal, insulin is our storage manager where it's helping store things, package it for later, so that way we can have it, for example, when we sleep at night. And then when we're in a fasted state or when our blood sugar drops, that's where we have glucagon that helps find that energy from things like our liver or our fat stores to help break down and make sure that we're keeping that blood sugar in a tight range, because again, that is our energy currency throughout all of our cells. So without blood sugar going through our system, our cells just wouldn't have any energy, and then we feel tired and crappy all the time. And maybe if that is you, there could be a little layer of insulin resistance in there. So insulin isn't inherently the bad guy, as I mentioned. Where things go wrong is when the body stops listening to insulin. So remember when we were talking about type 2 diabetes, you have all of these emails that are just circulating and circulating, but we have these spam filters that are preventing things from getting to where they need to go. And insulin resistance is kind of, again, like those emails just not hitting the inbox. So imagine the messages are getting caught in the spam filters or they're bouncing back. The departments are supposed to act on the messages like your muscle or your fat cells, and they never see it. So what does the boss do? The boss sends more emails and then sends more and more and more and more. That's essentially what your pancreas is doing. If that insulin message isn't getting through, it's releasing more and more insulin to help force those messages to land. But over time, you end up with a flooded inbox. All of a sudden, you go to check your spam folder and you're like, holy cow, I didn't know Google now sorted things into promotions. What's going on? Like, we have all of these spam filters that are set up, but the message isn't being acted upon very well. What we're seeing, especially with maybe women in particular, is because of, partly because of the body composition differences between women and men, women tend to be more insulin sensitive, meaning that when you get some of these big fluctuations, or for example, your pancreas is sending out all of these emails and flooding your system, that can have a drastic impact on your hormones. But it also means that hormonal shifts that just come naturally with being a female, so getting pregnant, menopause, PCOS, just your monthly cycle, like every time you feel like you're finally on the other end of things just start going downhill again, right? But women especially can have strong influence on those insulin dynamics. And one thing that can really help, whether you're a woman or a man, to help clear out that spam filter and improve insulin resistance is moving. If you are moving your bodies when that muscle contracts during exercise, you can actually pull those emails out of the spam filter and delete them forever. So essentially, when you contract your muscle, that can really help pull that glucose out of your bloodstream and help get it into the muscle without relying on insulin. Again, going back to the email analogy or tying things up, that muscle contraction is kind of like walking down the hall, delivering the message in person instead of sending another email that's not going to get there. It bypasses the spam filters, and that's why movement matters so much. Even low impact exercises like walking or stretching or rucking, anything that's going to help contract those muscles is going to help your muscles soak up that blood sugar without insulin and make your body more responsive to insulin over time. So I just can't stress enough. And being a dietitian that specializes in things like blood sugar and CGM and metabolic health, as much as I just want to say nutrition and food are the key, the more I learn about this topic, the more I just see how really our muscle and movement can help really lay that foundation for how we're utilizing things like glucose and insulin. So my dietitian heart, yes, nutrition is very important. Eating whole, real foods is very important. But movement is just something that I think is missing for a lot of folks. And this is where insulin resistance can really build, especially with our, diet and lifestyle nowadays. It's very much a lot of ultra processed foods, meaning that you're kind of spiking your blood sugar and your insulin multiple times a day. You're going up and down and up and down and up and down. And this is why you're hungry and tired and crabby and you're not sleeping at night. But movement is one of those things that can really help point or start getting that needle moving in the right direction. Ultimately, insulin resistance really creates the perfect storm for weight gain. So again, thinking about those circulating emails, the messages aren't getting to where it needs to go. We're stuck in storage mode. And fat breakdown slows, if at all. So again, you've got those emails in circulation. When those emails or that insulin is circulating, you can't, get to your inbox to be able to partition other things like your fat stores. So your fat breakdown slows down, your fat storage increases. So your pancreas is just pushing out, again, more of those signals. Your hunger signals change a lot too because those messages aren't getting received. So all of a sudden you've just got this really big communication issue and then your blood sugar is all over the place. And unfortunately our system now just looks very much at what glucose is doing and not insulin. There's this line I love from Ben Bickman, and he talks about how insulin is like fertilizer for your fat cells. And that just really creates this perfect picture or perfect storm of what insulin can do. So insulin is like fertilizer for your fat cells, and that early insulin resistance is often starting in your muscle and your fat cells. Again, movement can really help counter that. But meanwhile, your liver just keeps storing fat too, which just exacerbates the issue. So what happens is we see your triglycerides tend to maybe start to creep up. Maybe you've got fatty liver. You start to see rising insulin levels. And this reminds me of one client in particular. We were looking at her CGM data, and it actually looked really, really great. So if you don't know what CGM is, essentially we're able to see what her blood sugar is in real time. And we're inferring by what her blood sugar looks like, what her insulin is doing. And I was shocked, actually. We looked at her blood sugar data and I was like, oh my gosh, I was really hoping for some better feedback here. And come to find out, some of her other labs were way out of whack. So her triglycerides were starting to climb up. Her A1C was climbing up. And again, this is where I get really, really impatient with providers who are like, oh, let's just keep an eye on it. Like your A1C is creeping up. We're just going to keep an eye on it. If you see that A1C creeping up, you're probably in some insulin resistance already. And I'll give you a couple tips on some helpful labs that can maybe paint a better picture. But in this client in particular, we saw some of those labs creeping up, even though her blood sugar looked fine. And what happens is a lot of times you've got so much insulin in circulation that is falsely lowering some of that blood sugar because your pancreas is doing a really good job kicking out insulin. But even though we didn't get maybe as helpful data as we thought with the CGM, it really helped us show that, okay, your CGM data doesn't look bad yet, because once your pancreas starts to peter out, you don't have enough insulin to keep up with those blood sugar levels, then we really see things skyrocket in those later stages of insulin resistance or diabetes. So what happened is, even though she had great blood sugar data, we did kind of cap her carbs a little bit, and we started to work on things like movement. And that really helped get the needle going in the other direction. So she came to me, she was really bothered by abdominal weight gain, just despite, eating what we would call like relatively healthy and not changing anything in her diet. She was really struggling with weight gain, but just knowing and getting some other data, like her fasting insulin, for example, we got this data that just showed us like, okay, we know that you've certainly got some insulin resistance going on, and we made movement a priority, and we're really able to, narrow her focus, give her some direction, and get that needle moving again. Also on episode 4, I talked about how fasting insulin can be really helpful just to see what insulin is doing behind the scenes, because again, with a CGM, we're kind of inferring what insulin is doing, and unfortunately, we just have a very glucose-centric diagnosis framework. So we look at things like A1C or fasting blood sugar to diagnose things like diabetes, but diabetes is really an insulin problem. It's not a blood sugar problem. Yes, it is, but insulin can change years or even decades before we start to see the glucose change. So if you really want to know what your body's doing, look at insulin, because glucose is going to follow. And unfortunately, by the time we start to see blood sugar change, it's just too late, and we've got some insulin resistance that's set in. Again, there are some things that we can do to prevent or reverse some of that, but if you can get ahead of it and have a more proactive approach, that can really help. I mentioned fasting insulin. On episode 4, I talk more on obesity and lab markers. So that one is an Ask Me Anything or AMA, where I dive into more lab markers. But I would say for insulin resistance in particular, fasting insulin can be really helpful. Another marker, if you don't want to go out and get your fasting insulin checked, is you can take your triglycerides and your HDL. So these are two things that will come in your annual physical. So you take your triglyceride number, you take your HDL, and you divide those two. So that triglyceride to HDL ratio can essentially act as like a poor man's insulin resistance test. So you take your triglycerides, you divide that by HDL, and usually anything that's over 1.5, my, yellow flag is starting to go up. So ideally, that triglyceride to HDL ratio is less than 1.5. If it's higher than that, then we know that maybe you're in some earlier, even later stages of insulin resistance. And one other blood marker that can, maybe not blood marker, but blood pressure is one of those things that we can monitor too, because insulin tells your kidneys to hold on to sodium. So when insulin comes down, whether that is through movement or maybe you're doing some sort of carb restriction or intermittent fasting, however you're managing your diet or lifestyle to help bring down that insulin, when insulin comes down, all of a sudden you're not holding on to as much sodium, and you might see your blood pressure come down. So it's not necessarily salt that is the bad guy when it comes to blood pressure. A lot of times it is high insulin, which causes you to hold on to sodium. So I always like to clarify that, because I know I get a lot of people that are nervous about salt, and honestly, it is one of the last things that I'm usually looking at. And a little bit of a teaser on what you can expect in part 2. We'll be talking about what we can do nutrition-wise, exercise-wise, to help fight against things like insulin resistance. But I will say that one of the worst things that you can do if you are insulin resistant is go on a low-fat diet. please don't do that. Because oftentimes when you're taking something out like fat, that means that you're adding something else in, usually higher carbs, which is just going to make the need for insulin even more pronounced, and that can worsen the problem for a lot of individuals. So that's my one kind of teaser or spoiler for part 2, is don't go on a low fat diet if you have insulin resistance. And some simple takeaways, or just to summarize our key points today. So insulin is essential. It's not necessarily the enemy that we like to maybe think it is. And ultimately, the real issue is insulin resistance. When we lose insulin sensitivity, we become insulin resistant. So it's not the insulin itself that is the bad guy, because when insulin stays chronically high, it becomes harder to access stored fat, and that can really make your weight loss journey a lot harder than it needs to be. Stay tuned for part 2 of this series. I will be talking a little bit more of the how we become insulin resistant, and what to do about it to help either prevent or reverse things. And if you found this episode helpful, please share it with a friend, or consider giving a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. All you have to do is scroll down to the bottom of the show. You'll see the ratings there. You tap 5 stars, and that just helps me find new folks like yourselves and help more people. So thank you again. If you are interested in checking out the metabolic assessment that I mentioned earlier in the episode, I will link that in the show notes below. Otherwise, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. My ETA for part 2, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, things are a little bit crazy. So my wishful thinking is for next week. It might be 2 weeks. It might be 3 weeks. We will really see what life throws at us this week. So hope all is well with you and your families, and we will see you on the next one.